and welcome to Sophie & Co. I'm Sophie Shevardnadze. Will ending U.S. foreign intervention solve its international problems? And would it also mean an end to terror? Historian, author of a number of best-selling books, including America's Deadliest Export and Rogue State, William Bloom is my guest today.
After the quagmires of Iraq and Afghanistan, Washington is changing its tactics. Ground interventions are out, airstrikes and training missions are in. Is the US growing tired of foreign endeavors? Can it afford to stay off of them entirely? And how will the world change if America stops trying to change it?
William Bloom, historian and author of bestsellers like Rogue State and America's Deadliest Export. Welcome to the show. It's great to have you with us. Now, Hillary Clinton has announced she's running to become the Democrats' presidential candidate. Jeb Bush is also likely to put forward his bid for the Republicans. Now, Bush, Clinton, we've been here before. Who would be better candidate, do you think? Not just for the US, but also for the world, like global peace efforts, for instance.
I don't think U.S. foreign policy will change at all, regardless of who's in the White House, Bush or Clinton or who else is running. Our policy does not change. Obama, I can add Obama to that. It wouldn't even matter which party it is, independent of which candidate. I mean, Republican or Democrat, they have the same foreign policy.
Why do you think it's the same policy for both parties? Why do you think there are no different from each other?
Because America, for 2 centuries, has had one basic overriding goal, and that is world domination. At least from the 1890s, if not earlier, one can say that. World domination is something which appeals to both Republicans and Democrats, or liberals or conservatives. The idea that we, the exceptional nation, have something very important to impart to the rest of the world. Our marvelous values, American exceptionalism, each party believes in that very, very strongly. There's no, they don't argue about that at all, except during a campaign debate. They'll take certain opposing views just to appear different. But in power, they have the exact same policy, world domination.
Now, back in 2009, President Obama made it clear that the missile shield in Europe would no longer be necessary if the threat from Iran were eliminated and a nuclear deal with Iran were struck. Now, a historic deal is close, but NATO's saying there will be no change in the missile shield plans. Why not?
Because NATO shares America's desire to dominate the world. NATO is just an arm of U.S. foreign policy. There's no point actually in making a distinction between U.S. foreign policy and NATO policy. They are the same. If the U.S. was not in NATO, NATO would not exist. The U.S. founded NATO. The U.S. is its main supporter and financial source. There's no distinction between the U.S. and NATO, and they share the same view of American world domination. And so it doesn't matter whether Iran is doing this or that. They know that Iran is not a lover of the empire, and anyone who is not a lover of the empire has a short lifespan. Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, whatever, that is the test. Do you love the empire or not?
But can we be a little more precise about this domination theory? NATO has been strengthening its eastern borders with a military building up on Russia's doorsteps at a rapid reaction force to include 30,000 personnel. Why this deployment? Who is it aimed against?
It's aimed against Russia. The U.S. cannot stand anyone who might stand in the way of the empire's expansion. And Russia and China are the only nations which can do that. Other nations, like Cuba or Iran or Venezuela, are regarded as enemies just as well because they have the power to influence. Cuba has influenced all of the Western Hemisphere. That makes them a great enemy. But the basic criterion is the empire's expansion and whether you support the empire or not. And that excludes all the countries I've named, from Cuba to Russia.
So,
and it just may sound simple.
Do you think the U.S. would go as far as using force against its enemies?
Well, the U.S. has used force against its enemies on a regular basis for 2 centuries. Of course they would use force. They've used force against Cuba. They invaded Cuba, and they've supported Cuba kinds of violent activities for 60 years. Violence is never far removed from U.S. policy. Let me summarize something for the benefit of our listeners. Since 1946, the United States has attempted to overthrow more than 50 foreign governments. In that same time period, it has attempted to assassinate more than 50 foreign leaders. It has attempted to, it has bombed the people of 30 countries. It has suppressed revolutionary parties in at least 20 nations. And there's more to that. I forget my other factor on my list. This is a record unparalleled in all of human history. And there's no reason to think it's changing or will change, except if some superior force comes on the scene and can actually defeat the United States.
But, you know, the French intelligence, and France seems to be an ally of the United States. The French intelligence chief has recently said they found no evidence of Russia planning to invade Ukraine. So why has NATO been pressing these claims of an imminent invasion so hard and for so long?
Because Russia has the 2 characteristics of an enemy which Washington cannot tolerate. One, it has very powerful military capabilities, and 2, it is not a client of Washington's policies. It's not a great admirer of the empire. The same applies to China. That's all it takes. You don't admire us, and you have military force. That's all it takes to be a major enemy of Washington.
But the problem is that there's a ceasefire that seems to be in place, right? But U.S. paratroopers have arrived in Ukraine to train forces in the country, and it's not the first such deployment we've seen. So with the ceasefire agreement and the peace deal underway, why is Washington sending troops now?
Yeah, because they know very well that Ukraine is not, or those who support Russia, who live in Ukraine, Washington knows very well that these people are not on their side and will not be on their side, and there's no way to make them on our side. So the U.S. is expecting to wipe them out militarily at some point in the near future, as soon as they can get all the politics in place. There's no backtracking from these policies. I must say, repeat myself again. Washington wants to dominate the world, and anyone, including the people of Ukraine and the southeastern part of Ukraine, who don't share that view, they are enemies. And at some point, they may be met with military force.
So are you saying that America doesn't want peace in Ukraine because the U.S. is sending military personnel to Ukraine, like I've said, while Europeans are negotiating peace without American involvement?
Washington is not looking for peace or war. It's looking for domination. And if they can achieve domination peacefully, that's fine. If they can't, they'll use war. It's that simple.
So like you said, America is one of the main financiers of NATO. So there's also Estonia, and they meet NATO's funding goals. Why are the rest of its members lagging behind? Isn't the alliance important to them as well?
They each have their own home politics to deal with. They each have their own financial needs to deal with. They each have their own relation with Washington to deal with. It varies. This is not exactly the same in each country, but overall, no member of NATO is going to fight against Washington. No member of NATO is going to support the insurgents in Ukraine. Not one. So that there's no need to dwell upon who is not paying and who is paying. None of them will ever go against Washington's policies in Ukraine or elsewhere.
Now, on the other hand, Europe, US, and Russia, they share similar security threats. Issues like Syria, Islamic State, there's Afghanistan, and they're not going anywhere. Can these states work together if it's absolutely necessary, for example?
They don't have the same security threats. Washington just announces that various countries are enemies of the U.S. That doesn't make them a threat. Syria, for example, is no threat to the United States. Neither was Iraq. Neither was Libya. The U.S. invades one country after another, totally independent of whether they're a threat or not. As long as they don't believe in the empire, as long as they're helping enemies of the empire. I mean, what threat was Libya to Washington? The U.S. and NATO invaded them without mercy, bombed them out of existence. They were a failed state now. What was the threat? There's no threat. If Russia doesn't announce Libya as a threat, it's not because Russia has a different foreign policy. It's because Russia is not so paranoid as the U.S. And Russia is not looking for world domination.
Mr. Blum, we're going to take a short break right now. When we come back, we'll continue talking to historian and best-selling author William Blum about America's foreign interventions and if the U.S. could ever give up on them. Stay with us. And we're back with William Blum, author of numerous bestsellers on U.S. foreign policy. Welcome back to the show. So, Mr. Blum, Russia has been criticized many times for its decision to supply air defense missile system to Iran. Now, why is America so worried about the anti-air missile defense Iran may buy from Russia? I mean, it's not like Washington's got plans to bomb Iran, right?
Well, of course they do. So does Israel. You can't put aside those fears. Washington, as I mentioned before, has bombed more than 30 countries. Why would they stop now? Iran is a definite target of the U.S. and of Israel, and it's very understandable that Iran would want to have advanced missile defense systems.
But look, the U.S. is staying out of Yemen now. It's not willing to commit ground troops to Iraq or get involved in Syria. I mean, it sometimes looks like, Washington is growing wary of foreign interventions lately.
No, they're still supporting the enemies of Syria. They are making sure that Assad will not come back to power. They are can be useful militarily to Syria. They have not forgotten about Syria at all. And Iraq is at the moment an ally, but tomorrow or yesterday it's something different. You can't just look at today and say they're not fighting here or there and think, oh, Washington has finally found peace. No, their basic goal is unchanged today or tomorrow or next year. And I must say again for the 10th time, it's world domination.
Now, you've written in one of your books, The Rogue State, that if you were president, you'd end all U.S. foreign intervention at once. Can the U.S. do that? I mean, is it that simple? U.S. left Iraq and look what happened.
If I were the president, yes, that's what I would do. I would do all kinds of things. And then I add, the portion you're quoting, I add at the end of that paragraph, on my 5th day in office, I would be assassinated. So that's what happens to people who want to challenge the empire's policies. But I would have a great time for the first few days.
But can the U.S. realistically do that and all their foreign interventions at once? Because we see an example of Iraq that once they left, ISIS spread.
The U.S. is created ISIS. Let me point this out. Up until a short while ago, there were 4 major states in the Middle East and in South Asia which were secular. The U.S. invaded Iraq, then invaded Libya, and overthrew that secular government. And then it's been in the process now for some years, attempting to overthrow the secular government of Syria. Is it any wonder that the Middle East and South Asia have been taken over by religious fanatics? All the possible enemies and barriers to that have been wiped out by Washington. Why will they stop now?
All right. I see your point, and while Iraq and Afghanistan cannot be exactly described as victories for the American troops, I mean, the invasions have also resulted, for instance, in girls being able to go to school in Afghanistan, or Kurds finally having a state in Iraq, for instance.
Listen, my dear. Listen, I must tell you something, and all your listeners. At one time in the 1980s, Afghanistan had a progressive government where women had full rights. They even wore miniskirts. And you know what happened to that government? The United States of America overthrew it. So please do not tell me about the U.S. policy helping the girls or the women of Afghanistan. We are the great enemy of the females of Afghanistan.
All right. You also said that an end to U.S. interventions would mean an end to terror attacks. What makes you think Islamic State and Al-Qaeda and other terror groups would cease to exist? And I'm talking about right now. I'm not talking about if America hadn't invaded them back then. Right now, if American interventions cease, what makes you think that these terrorist groups would cease to exist as well?
It may be too late now. When I wrote that, it was correct what I said. It may be too late now. After what we've done to all the secular governments in the Middle East and in South Asia, after all that, I'm not sure I would say the same thing again. We've unleashed the ISIS, and they are not going to be stopped by any kind words or nice changes of policy of Washington. They will have to be wiped out militarily. They are an amazing force of horror. And the U.S. is responsible for them, but the barn door may be closed. It may be too late now to simply change our policy.
So do you think U.S. should use military force to eradicate these terrorist groups?
Well, I can say yes, except that the U.S. will cheat. They will use the same force to attack other people, like in Syria. They will use the same force to help overthrow Assad. And they will use the same force to suppress any segments of Iraq or what have you, which are anti-American. They cannot be trusted. That's the problem. When they start to use force, there's no holding them back. And they don't care about civilians. The civilian death toll with any bombing of Syria and Iraq is unlimited. So for those reasons, I cannot support the U.S. bombing of Iraq or Syria or anywhere else. The U.S. bombing should cease all over the world.
But, when I listen to you, it sounds like, America overthrows all these governments and bombs all these countries and makes revolutions. But from people's point of view, revolutions and overthrows are really impossible if it's not conducive to people's moods on the ground. So you're saying the foreign policy has really contributed to the rise of radical Islam in the Middle East, but I wonder, don't locals have control over their own direction at all?
The locals had no say whatsoever in whether the U.S. would bomb them or not. They had no say whatsoever whether the U.S. would overthrow the government. But it's too late. They can't do anything about it. The world is in a terrible position. The world had a chance 20, 30 years ago to stop the U.S. from all these interventions. If NATO had been closed the way the Warsaw Pact was closed, the Soviet Union closed down the Warsaw Pact with the understanding or the expectation that NATO would also go out of business. But the U.S. did not do that. And so they cheated again. And it's too late now. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to say to save the world now.
Mr. Bloom, you've mentioned Cuba and Venezuela in the beginning of the program. Now, we witnessed several historic meetings recently between President Obama and Cuba's President Raul Castro, also Obama's meeting with Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro. Why is Obama now talking with states the U.S. has long considered arch enemies?
You must keep in mind, first of all, that nothing whatsoever has changed. As of this moment, nothing has changed. So we have to wait and see what happens. And I'm very skeptical. For example, with Cuba, the main issue is the U.S. sanctions, which have played havoc with the Cuban economy and society. That has not changed, and I don't think it will change even in my lifetime. So we can't speak of, you can't imply that some kind of a change is taking place. Why Obama is saying these things he's saying now may have to do with the so-called legacy. He knows his time is very limited, and he knows he has many enemies amongst progressives in the U.S. and elsewhere. He may be wanting to cater to them for some reason. I don't know. Neither do you know. No one knows exactly why he's saying these things, but they don't mean anything yet. That nothing has changed whatsoever.
So you're saying there's really no substance to all these meetings. Now, looking back, what would you call Obama's biggest achievements of his 2 terms? I mean, people say there's reconciliation with Cuba, with Iran. There is an earnest attempt to end U.S. deployment in Iraq and Afghanistan. Obama didn't move troops into Syria. Would you disagree with all of that?
Yes, all of it. There's no accomplishment whatsoever. He didn't move troops into Syria because of Russia, and not because of him having any change. And he was embarrassed in that. He made some remark about, John Kerry made a remark about would be nice if Syria would get rid of its chemical weapons, but that's not going to happen, he said. And then Foreign Minister Lavrov of Russia jumped in and said, "Oh, really? We'll arrange that." And they arranged for Syria to get rid of their chemical weapons. That was just a slip of the tongue by John Kerry, and he was embarrassed to challenge Lavrov. One can say the same thing about any of the things you mentioned. There's no substance involved in any of these policies. The U.S. has not relented at all with Syria. As I mentioned before, they're bombing Syria's military assets here and there. They're killing civilians every day. Syria is still a prime target of Washington, and they will never escape.
Mr. Bloom, thank you very much for this interesting insight. We were talking to William Bloom, historian, author of bestsellers Rogue State, America's Deadliest Export, discussing matters of U.S. foreign policy and what would happen if the U.S. decided to end all of its foreign interventions at once. That's it for this edition of Sophie & Co. I will see you next time.